Yeah, so my biggest fear with all of this is that I'll start the podcast, I'll do a whole thing, and then I just don't press record.
Very Freudian, right?
No, it could happen, man. I just you just saw it. I almost didn't press the record button on the speaker there. So okay, so I just have to do a few maintenance things, then we will go ahead and get started. So, all right, so upcoming episodes, Mr. Deshaun Boatwright. I'll be traveling to Richmond, Virginia in hopefully in a month, maybe more, maybe less. He's a former MMA fighter. I've known him since middle of high school. He's one of the funniest guys I've ever met in my life, but he's also one of the nicest guys. And he is frequently posting videos of him training kids, adults in Richmond. I don't know if he's training them to be fighters, but they're definitely getting more healthy. So I want to talk to him and see what he's been up to since I knew him back in school. Dr. Donald Brown. He will also hopefully be next month. Just a legit guy, just a kind human being, and he'll be talking about mental health and the U.S. justice system. And then after that, these are unconfirmed, but I'm trying to get this hair restoration guy to come in and talk to me. No, it's important. I think it's important.
It is a major industry for sure.
Yeah, me being in my 30s, it's even more important now. So
you look pretty good.
Thank you.
I could use a little.
Well, hey, if he comes in and talks to me, we'll exchange information. All right, so yeah, that'll be that. But he'll also be talking about women, because sometimes they need, some touch-ups too. So, and then I'm also trying to lock down a guest that'll be talking about sex trafficking. So I got a lot of things coming down the pipeline. Also to the people, I have not forgotten about you in India, Cambodia, Ireland, the Philippines, and Canada. These are people that were listening in my first 3 episodes, and then because I moved from Baltimore to Los Angeles, and I was off for 3 months, and I have not seen these people listening since. So I lost these guests, and I'm trying to reconnect. So if any of these people in these areas of the world are watching or listening to this, I would love to hear from you. I haven't given up just yet. And lastly, so the topic for today will be marijuana. Okay, so for the weed enthusiasts, the anti-weed people, for the people that are on the fence about marijuana, for the people that don't care, you are all welcome to today's conversation. Okay, if you feel yourself getting angry, upset, or irritable about anything being said today, hit the pause button. Hit the pause button, take a walk, come back in 5 minutes, take a few deep breaths. Come on back, ride this train with us. We're just talking. We're just talking. Relax. So your experience with weed may not be what our patients have experienced with weed, and it might not be representative of the general population. So I can assure you that everything that we will discuss today will be from our professional, anecdotal, and scientific perspective. Okay, we're just talking. Relax. All right, relax. It's okay. All right. Do you have anything you want to add to that last bit that I?
No, I'm very relaxed in this studio of yours. It's just beautiful lighting. Temperature's perfect.
Glad you like it.
Great. I love the fanboy stuff. It's really great.
Oh man, that warms my heart. All right. So you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. All right, so I am here with Dr. Timothy Fong. You graduated from Northwestern University for undergrad and for medical school, correct?
I did.
Okay. You did your psych residency at UCLA. You did your addiction fellowship at UCLA also.
That's right.
In fact, you were the first fellow.
I was the first accredited fellow back in 2002, yes.
Oh, crap. I forgot to tell you. Okay, so the mic. Bring the mic. Close to just close to your face, and you can move it around as you see fit.
This is good. Yeah.
You got options. All right, just keep it close to your face. That way, people will be able to hear you. You are co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies program.
That's right.
You are director of the UCLA Addiction Fellowship. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you are also a part of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative.
That's absolutely true.
Okay. Everything I've said is factual.
Guilty as charged, yes.
Anything you'd like to add? Did I miss anything?
No, I mean, people ask, well, what do you do? I'm like, well, I say first and foremost, I'm a addiction psychiatrist. I'm a doctor that specializes in understanding and treating the causes of addictions. And they say, well, what kind of addiction? I say all kinds: substances, behavioral, chemical, you name it, natural. But at the end of the day, I'm just about trying to help people get their lives better.
Yeah.
Finding solutions to very challenging questions. Why do people get addicted? What can we do to help them? How do we prevent them? How do we help them in recovery? So that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking on the different types of addictions, when I met you, we just talked about this earlier. You did a presentation on gambling and marijuana. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So you also dip into gambling and well, any other type of addiction.
Absolutely. And that's how I got started back in 2005, was really studying gambling addiction here in California.
Mm-hmm.
And we go back to 15 years ago, and what we were seeing is rapid expansion of gambling in California, tribal casinos, internet gambling, the poker boom, sports betting. So gambling was really everywhere. But we weren't seeing a lot of gambling addiction in the hospitals or the clinics. But that led me, as a resident of California, to say, well, where are these men and women? It's an addictive behavior, but they're not showing up to the clinic or the emergency rooms. And lo and behold, we found them, and they're there. And people are suffering from this condition of gambling disorder, and that led us to create a statewide gambling program back in 2009 to really provide no-cost treatment to anyone in California who's suffering from a gambling addiction, as well as anyone affected by someone else's gambling addiction. But that was 2009, and then as the years have progressed, what's happened in California? 2016, cannabis, marijuana legalized. January 2018, that was when the first dispensary opened in California for recreational use. Where my story came into that, I was thinking, gosh, we have gambling, we have treatment for gambling addiction, but in January 2018, we did not have really good treatments for cannabis addiction or marijuana addiction. And lo and behold, here we are opening up a state to legalize this. How are we going to minimize its damage? How are we going to maximize how to use it properly for society? And that's kind of how I got into that world of cannabis. It's weird. People say, wait a minute, you made your mark doing gambling work. What does gambling have to do with marijuana? What does gambling have to do with cannabis? They're not hand in hand like gambling and alcohol or gambling and tobacco or even gambling and sex seem to run hand in hand. But that's when we met. I was doing a presentation. It was called probably Gambling and Cannabis, What's Lying in the Weeds. Right. What's lying in the weeds.
And I did have that reaction. I said, what?
Right. So what do you remember about that presentation? What was your takeaway?
Well, it lines with one of my first questions for you. It's just the first thing that you brought up was why you use the term cannabis versus marijuana.
Right.
And I think you went through not a whole story. I mean, you kept it brief because it's obviously a presentation, but you went into why it's gotten that term.
Yeah.
Why is it called?
Well, here's the story. It's a whole thing. When I was in high school, and I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, we didn't have cannabis. We barely had marijuana. And we had alcohol, we had tobacco, but it was kind of hard to get marijuana. And then I went to college in Northwestern. Started to hear more about this, and people, hey, you want a little weed, you want a little pot, you want a little marijuana.
Not to date you, but what year, what time was this?
I graduated high school in 1990.
Okay.
And college in 94. So, okay. I mean, it was there, but I didn't really hear much about it. I didn't think much about it.
Right.
But I did think of it classically. If you use pot, you must be a, quote, stoner. Long hair, Frampton Records, don't shave, don't really do much with your life. So
grungy.
Grungy. And that's what I grew up with, and that's so important because when I started to do academic work in marijuana and cannabis research, I didn't appreciate where the word marijuana came from. Mm-hmm. And number one, it's not a scientific term. So cannabis is the scientific term for the plant. And cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, these are all the different strains of the plant based on botanical names. Marijuana is a cultural term.
Okay.
The term predominantly used by Mexican Americans and Latino culture or Latinx cultures to just describe the cannabis plant.
Mm-hmm.
But why it's steeped in so much history is that it's the Marijuana Prohibition Act, 1914, 1918, that was used by our federal government at the time to essentially put a prohibition on a plant.
This goes back over 100 years ago.
Over 100 years. That really didn't have that much damage to public health. So it's the same story across all the other drugs of abuse. Here was a plant, a naturally derived plant that was used by minority culture, part of family celebration, birthday, quinceañeras, whatever. It didn't really cause damage like in the way of deaths and overdoses that you think about. And then here's a federal government saying, hey, we're concerned about this usage. We're concerned that this plant is causing more of a public health issue than we actually have data on. And then you see the history of it, things like Reefer Madness, movies that depict people who use marijuana and becoming crazed and sexually aggressive and criminal behavior.
There's a movie?
Yeah, it's a movie called Reefer Madness. It's one of the first kind of propaganda movies about marijuana. Again, all highlighting that marijuana was associated with minority groups, Mexican Americans, immigrants, lowbrow folks, people associated with crime. And I never appreciated that degree of racism and discrimination against and stereotype of people who use marijuana until I really started studying that.
Okay.
If you look at the DSM-5, our handbook, our psychiatric handbook, marijuana does not show up anywhere. It's cannabis. So the proper term that we come to realize is that I study cannabis, or we study the effects of cannabis on body, brain, and mind. And that the term marijuana is just, again, cultural and steeped with all hundreds of years of tradition of discrimination and racism. And frankly, it's incorrect. So, and it brings up and evokes just the term marijuana, all these false images. And I think that's the key. Because when I first heard this, hey, don't use the word marijuana, I'm like, why not? And I thought about it in my own life, because when I think of the word marijuana, I think of those kids dropping out of high school.
Well, you also thought of them that way too.
I thought of them that way as well, stereotype, and that absolutely, it not only just poor science, but it's just dangerous to perpetuate stereotypes. So that's why I've really gone away from using marijuana. But you see, in languages and state bills throughout, you still see a lot of the term marijuana in bills and legislative things, so that we still have a long way to go to kind of sharpen up our vocabulary around this.
Yeah, so you mentioned cannabis is a plant, right? I think we have a feeling for what certain drugs are, right? With weed, I call it weed. I'll use cannabis I'll do my best to use cannabis from now on. I have sort of a feel of what it is, of what it looks like. But looking at it more in depth with what it actually is, it's a plant, right? But what does it actually do in the human body? What is cannabis?
Well, and that's a whole career in of itself. But here's the thing about all the substances that are out there that we can enjoy. Alcohol, it's a plant. Cocaine, it's a plant. Tobacco, it's a plant.
Right.
Opiates, it's a plant. Cannabis, it's a plant. Sugar, it's a plant. So cannabis, from just a pure botanical description, is just simply a plant. And there's a wide variety of different plants. Now, I'm not a botanist, but well over 40, 50, 60 different kind of species of the cannabis class of plant. And to actually determine, is this plant cannabis versus something else, that's going to be botanical definitions based on seeds and growth and patterns of its leaf and, the products it spills out. There's male cannabis plants, there's female cannabis plants, there's, again, a wide variety. And hey, you and I went to medical school. We didn't get that lecture on botany.
No, we wouldn't.
But it's fascinating. And a lot of this, to be honest, I went to a place called the Museum of Weed that was here in California last year. It was a pop-up museum tracing the history of the cannabis plant in America, and it showed a lot of these botanical history to it. But the long and short of it is the cannabis plant has inside it well over 100 different kind of chemicals that were called cannabinoids.
Okay.
These chemicals, cannabinoids, when they get inside our body, affect all sorts of things in our body, brain, and mind. And our body in itself, we generate our own natural version of cannabinoids. So our body and our certain cells in our bodies, just like it spits out dopamine or serotonin.
So we have cannabinoids.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
Our body generates this chemical called endocannabinoids. but we can also ingest it that's produced externally by these plants. And that's the part, is that there's 100 different kinds of plant-derived cannabinoids that have a variety of different effects on our body. The number one, if this were like Billboard Top 100, what is the number one cannabinoid compound in ever? It's THC. It's the one that, of course, is psychoactive. It gets to the brain. It's the one that everyone knows about. It's the one that has a wide variety of effects. The number two ranked, pound for pound, if you want to use combat language, would probably be CBD, cannabidiol. And that's gotten so much attention in the last 10 years as a non-psychoactive cannabinoid that could help with pain, anxiety, sleep, general sense of wellness. But again, there's 100 of these different characters.
So those big two, THC and CBD, they're all working in the body, but just in different places.
Different places.
Different areas of the brain, which I imagine is why sometimes when people smoke, they also feel that, they increase their appetite.
That's right.
It's just a different area of the brain where appetite happens to be.
That's right.
Happens to be regulated.
Yeah, and even more specifically, cannabinoid receptors, like the parking lot, if you will. The receptors are everywhere in the brain, not just one part of the brain, everywhere. Learning, memory, mood, sleep, appetite, vision, hearing. And then in the body itself, pain receptors throughout the body, gut receptors that control whether you poo or you don't poo. So, I mean, it's everywhere. And that's why the cannabis industry, and I shouldn't say industry, the people who love cannabis, who swear by it, say, here's a natural product that when I take it makes my life better today and tomorrow. And I think that's why when we get to it later, it's just so fascinating, because never has there been a plant that's created so much intense response to it, emotionally, politically, historically, economically.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet there's so much mystery about it. So you're a big sci-fi fan, and I am as well. And one of my favorite, and not a lot of people will get this analogy, but one of my favorite shows in the 1980s was a show called The Greatest American Hero. And it was a show about a teacher who fell into a superhero costume that he got from aliens. And it came with an instruction manual on how to use this,
this is intense
costume. And in the pilot episode, he loses the instruction manual. So he has to figure out the course of the show when he puts on the suit, how to fly, how to use its powers, how to use the X-ray vision, how to use the super hearing. And he just has to figure it out. And I feel like cannabis is like that. Is that we have this incredible plant that has all these powers inside it. We don't quite yet know how to use it.
Still trying to figure that out.
Still trying to figure out, what dose, how to take it, how long to take it. When is too much too much? When is too little too little? Should it be regulated with more scrutiny, or should we let anyone just walk into
a dispensary
and buy it and away they go? So a lot of really fascinating questions, which is why I got into it, because to be honest, 10 years ago, 2010, I wasn't thinking about cannabis. I wasn't thinking about going into this field. We were building our gambling program. The opioid crisis were just then starting to get into full effect. That's where our time was being spent.
The opioid crisis.
Yeah, back in 2010, we were starting to see more of that. And of course, here in California, methamphetamine never went away, so we were seeing a lot of those patients. But no one ever thought that we would be doing this work with cannabis just even 10 years ago. So I'm really excited to kind of lay out some of our vision of what we think are important studies and what we're really seeing in the hospital and in the office setting.
Well, I think that's important. The information you mentioned about the it's going to be hard for me to say the receptors. Cannabinoid? Is that right? Okay. The cannabinoid receptors. I think that's hard for people to understand because, again, I think we all have a very surface level understanding about drugs and medication.
Yeah.
We just call them stimulants,
Yeah.
But if you really take a step back and look at stimulants, you're just hijacking systems that are already in the body.
That's right.
You're increasing dopamine, serotonin. It's already there in place. We're just hijacking
That's
it.
right.
And one of the differences between why one drug is more dangerous than another one of the biggest differences is how we use it. Are we using it responsibly?
Right.
Opiates are, I think, for anyone who breaks their leg, are fantastic. But if you use them for too long or at too higher dosages, you develop an addiction, which
Absolutely.
is what the opiate crisis. You could say the same thing for alcohol. It can be fun on a Friday night at happy hour.
Right.
But if you use it too much, for an extended period of time, it could, ruin your life.
It's always interesting to me. People say, I get this a lot, like, why shouldn't drugs be legal? And I always come back and say, well, why are alcohol and tobacco legal? Mm-hmm. What purposes do they serve for survival? There's no nutritional value in alcohol. There's no nutritional value in tobacco. And 500,000 Americans die every year from tobacco-related causes. About 100,000 die every year from alcohol-related causes. Mm-hmm. And yet there's very little, if ever, any call to get rid of these products from the face of the earth. It's real fascinating because I think cannabis is, again, hundreds of years behind that same story, because I always say to folks, things that should be illegal are things that are so dangerous that any person, even who's trying to use it responsibly, could end up dead, mm-hmm. or it serves no value or purpose to our society moving forward.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah. So tobacco and alcohol, if you think about it, in moderation, do they improve the quality of our lives? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But they're also a huge economic backbone of our society. Right. So if you were suddenly get rid of all those things, then you'd have millions of people unable to sustain themselves. But I think about larger world issues, and you do as well here: food, clothing, and water. Mm-hmm. And when it gets to things like these substances, what are the implications of us spending all that time, energy, and money in growing substances like alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis that don't lead to handling things like hunger or thirst?
Right.
So that's pretty metaphysical and all that. But at the end of the day, people say, do you think cannabis should be legalized? I say, absolutely, I do.
I agree.
I say absolutely it should be, but it needs to be regulated properly, mm-hmm. like tobacco and alcohol. And we need to do a much better job of explaining what the scientific facts are about it and demystifying what it's not. It's not a panacea. It's not the greatest thing since sliced bread. For some people, it can make their lives incredibly valuable. And one of the things I do is work in sports psychiatry. So we work with a lot of athletes, both professional and elite and amateur. And the question I always ask a lot of the athletes is, do you believe cannabis is performance enhancing? Some athletes are like, no way. It's just alcohol. It just takes the edge off. Others have looked me straight in the eye and said, oh, absolutely.
I feel better.
Absolutely.
I can concentrate.
It allows me to train. It allows me to focus. It allows me to recover. It allows me to deal with pain. And yeah, that's an edge over the next person. Mm-hmm. So very interesting question. I think what's been incredible, I think back to 2010, I didn't even set foot inside a dispensary because there wasn't one. There was just medical cannabis dispensaries in LA. Now, from where we are and sitting in your studios, we could deliver. We can, while we're talking, we could right now order up cannabis and have it delivered to your home,
California,
in probably the next 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Compared to what that was 20 years ago when I was walking around high school and everyone's like, what's that? What do you have in there? Where'd you get it? And, oh, I got it from a friend of a friend of a friend. And that was only 20 years ago. And imagine where we're going to be in 20 years from now.
Yeah.
In terms of what kind of cannabis is available to the average person.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the debate against and for legalization of cannabis is, obviously this is why I started off the show the way that I did, just speaking to both people that are advocates for, people that are advocates against. Mm-hmm. I'm also the type of person who believes that, it should be regulated. I'm not against it being legal. There's multiple reasons why it should be legalized, but I think it should be legalized. The argument for it being legalized without regulation is sometimes, this is what I hear.
Yeah.
I think I just heard this on TV just yesterday. Marijuana is less, cannabis.
There you go.
It's less harmful. I'm working on it. It's less harmful than alcohol. It's less harmful than cigarettes. And I can't disagree with that, but I think, I actually think back to when Prohibition was lifted, and I'm for Prohibition being lifted. I just think that they could have done it better.
Right.
If you've ever been to a party with someone or a group of friends, there's always that one person who has no idea how to drink.
That's right.
They get hammered on Friday, and then the next week they get hammered again. It's just like, did no one teach you what you're doing? Like there are ways to do this appropriately.
That's right.
Now, fair enough. I think people, regardless of whether or not you teach them how to use alcohol responsibly, they're still going to do what they do. But at the same time, I think it's mitigation of risk.
Yeah.
That's what it's about for me. It's mitigation of risk.
And again, thinking about when I grew up, I remember, health class, it was always, here are the drugs and what they do. But there wasn't a discussion of how do you know when it's too much?
Right.
Is it appropriate to even try? And I grew up in the 80s where it was just say no. So the themes were...
That was effective.
Right. Just say no. Don't even go there. So it was like going against everything about human nature that we want to celebrate, which is risk-taking.
Yeah.
Trying something new, being curious. That's all good stuff. But when you get curious and use a potential, an quote, illegal drug that's not regulated that could kill you, that's enormous. I mean, Len Bias's death in 1986 had an effect on me. I was 14.
For anyone, Len Bias is a basketball player. What team did he play for?
Played for the University of Maryland.
University of Maryland. Okay.
He was a first-round draft pick for the Boston Celtics, 1986.
An amazing talent.
Right. And this is a time when crack cocaine was rising in America, but it was unknown to the mainstream public. He died on draft night after partying, after being selected number 2, I think, by the Boston Celtics, and his death. And his death sparked essentially a war on drugs in the United States. His death sparked national discussion about what is crack cocaine, and we need to get rid of it. And unfortunately, created a generation of harsh penalties that were unjustified. But I remember its impact on me as a 14-year-old, thinking, what is crack cocaine? Where do I try it? I'm curious. Why did he die? What's going on? And those questions never really got answered when I was in high school, other than just discussions with my peers.
Right.
And you can imagine how kids trying to teach kids, that didn't go over very well. So I hear you loud and clear. And I think part of our hope is that we do more with cannabis education in elementary schools, in junior high, in high school, in colleges, and you name it. But look, at UCLA where we work, our biggest problem on campus with substances isn't cannabis. It's still alcohol, far and away.
Absolutely.
Far and away. And it's amazing that we still don't have enough alcohol prevention and early intervention programs on campuses at colleges, but we're getting there. But when it comes to cannabis, again, there's still absolutely huge risk. So people say to me, well, what does good regulation look like?
That's a good question.
Well, good regulation is based on science-based work. So the term I look is science-based legislation, science-based regulation, science-based treatment, science-based prevention. And it isn't just randomly throwing stuff out there because that sounds right or we think that works. You mentioned earlier, Just Say No is a perfect example. That is a major national initiative that eventually was a prevention campaign. But when you evaluate it, it didn't work at all in terms of changing attitudes, changing risk-taking behaviors, getting people to be more thoughtful in terms of their first usage of drugs or alcohol. It drove instead higher levels of stigma. It just said, don't use it, and if you do, you're no good. Just say no, meaning even if you have an addiction, you should have the willpower to just stop.
Right.
And I think that's an example where when you don't have science-based messages, you actually do create more harm than good. So some of the things I've been seeing around, like what are, when you drive around LA, you don't see any of those science-based messages for cannabis just yet. What do you see? You see a lot of billboards saying, stop right here.
Come on in.
Delivery service, buy 2, get a 3rd one free.
Right.
You don't see that. And you don't see, just an example, when you walk inside a dispensary, one of the concerns I have is the person behind the shelf. They're called bud tenders. That bud tender does not go through any sort of official training at all. If I go to a bar, or you and I go to a bar, non-pandemic, we know that bartender has to have training to have a bartender's license. Forget about the institute, the place. The person serving us alcohol has to have a license. The person cutting my hair, doing my nails, giving me a massage, they all have to be licensed. But as of right now, in 2020, the person selling me cannabis in a legal, regulated cannabis dispensary in California does not have to have any training whatsoever in cannabis science.
Yeah.
So that's an example of regulation that I think can be improved on.
Well, again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, where there will be pushback from people that will say, well, the people who sell me alcohol at the store, not necessarily behind the bar, they didn't go to school but again, We're not saying we're
right.
not saying that's right.
Right.
We're actually saying that's probably not right.
That's right. Not right. That's right. Yeah.
That's not right.
That's
you know,
right.
again, I mentioned the prohibition thing. I'm happy prohibition is gone, but it could have been done better.
Right.
You know, we might not have had all of the cases of alcohol addiction that we have now if people knew a little bit more about the substance that they were consuming.
Right.
So, I mean, just going along those lines of research, you are a part, I mentioned this during your intro, the Cannabis Research Initiative.
That's right.
What the hell is that?
Well, so many fascinating stories. So in 2016, when the state of California, it was Proposition 64, it was put out to the voters, the same election as the presidential election in November 2016.
Okay.
The question was, it was called the Adult Use Marijuana Act. They used the word marijuana. And the question was put to the citizens of California, shall California now regulate and sell cannabis to adults to use for recreational purposes? So again, it was recreational legalization of cannabis. But the number two part of that, this was really a social justice proposition. It was meant to take away the misdemeanors and the felonies associated with cannabis possession. It was also meant to give minorities and communities of color an ability to get into the cannabis industry. So those were some other really great things attached to it. But the core of it was to say, hey, our state is going to allow and accept the cannabis industry as a regulated marketplace.
Okay.
So with that in mind, when I looked around the state, there was very few academic centers that were studying cannabis. There was UCSD had a medicinal cannabis research center looking at kind of laboratory-based animal sort of things about what does cannabis do to the brain. And there was a researcher at UCI, University of California, Irvine, that was also doing some work there. But that was it. So a number of us at UCLA Medical School thought, well, you know what? This would make sense that if we turn our attention with the power of UCLA and all the research that we do there to try and create our own dedicated cannabis research program. That's why we came up with the word the Cannabis Research Initiative, because prior to our group, there was no formal cannabis research program at UCLA. There were people who had done research in various labs, but nothing centralized and organized.
No one was together.
No one was together. So it came out through an idea that we were going to approach it from our department of psychiatry, the general principle to better understand how does cannabis impact the body, brain, and mind. How do we unlock the therapeutic potential of it while also reducing the potential harm from it? So that's why I came at it with the vision of I wanted to study cannabis addiction, cannabis use disorder, and develop treatments to help people who develop an addiction to it. Our partner and our other faculty members also wanted to look at, for instance, cannabis and its impact on pain. Could we use cannabis instead of opiates to treat pain? One of our other researchers wanted to look at effect on cannabis and sex differences, men versus women. You know, a woman smokes a joint. How is it different than when a man smokes a joint? And what does it do to their body? So suddenly we're getting all these very interesting questions about cannabis, and that's how we created this initiative. So it's a chance for us faculty to get together and talk about cannabis, to talk about the research priorities, and then to start putting research grants together. And that's really where the last 3 years we've been focused on getting some research funding. We have funding right now from NIH to study cannabis and its impact on sex differences and other things. And now we're looking at getting funding from private donors, but also from the state of California. Proposition 64 set aside $10 million a year from revenues generated by cannabis sales to go back to studying the impact of cannabis through research.
Using the sale of cannabis to fund the research on cannabis.
And that's an example of, I think, good science-based legislation, is that use the revenue from a product that has both a lot of really great potential, but also potential harms, and give it to researchers who can study that and come up with a better understanding of how to use this properly. So that's a short version of it, of how we came to be and how we came to study its impacts, both good and bad and neutral. I mean, I'm not pro or against cannabis per se. I'm just pro understanding cannabis and using it in a better and healthier way. Right. You know, I'm originally from Chicago, but I consider myself an Angelino now. I'm still a huge Chicago sports fan, and I'll never root for Angeles sports teams, but we'll get to that at a later point. But we're raising our kids here. Yeah. And that's important for me to leave an impact for our kids about how to use cannabis properly. So I think those are some of the stories of how we got built. Well,
the interesting thing about doing research for cannabis is that it is Schedule 1. Does it oh, by the way, well, you can if you feel comfortable doing it. Could you explain what the DEA schedule that I just referred to? What is that exactly?
So the DEA, again, is a drug enforcement agency, of course, headed up by our United States government that oversees all handling of, quote, controlled substances throughout the United States. Not only its inflow into this country, but also how we handle it as a country. Back during the Nixon years, they created something called a scheduled, where they would list various substances based on their determination of how abusive this substance is, how likely is this substance to cause addiction. The highest level of, quote, abuse liability was called Schedule 1. Mm-hmm. So if you got on this list, that meant that this substance had, quote, no medically accepted value.
Which is hilarious today.
Very hilarious. So what's on that list? Imagine who's on this guest list. Well, it's LSD, it's heroin, it's PCP, it's cannabis. What's on Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, Schedule 5? Well, Schedule 5 are like some sleeping pills, Ambien, Lunesta. Schedule 2 are like the heavier narcotics like Dilaudid and morphine, methadone. Schedule 3 are things like tranquilizers like Ativan, Valium, Xanax, benzodiazepines, and things like that. But what does it mean is, number one, as a doctor, if the substance is on a scheduled medication, I have to have a special license by the DEA to even prescribe it. You and I, we can't prescribe Schedule 1. They say that is so dangerous, no one can touch it, no one can prescribe it, and furthermore, no one can do research on it unless you have an actual license granted to us by the DEA. Okay. So that's why cannabis research for the last 100 years has fallen way behind our knowledge of opioids or alcohol or cocaine. And you say, wait a minute, cocaine's Schedule 1, isn't it? Yes and no. Cocaine is also used in a lot of medicines for anesthesia, so it's a little easier to use it actually in the lab.
This is, again, when we go back to we're just hijacking the system.
Exactly.
We're using all of these the same substances. Exactly. We're using them. It's just the way you use them and how you use them.
Way to use them, way to classify. And so the biggest barrier, so let's say you and I want to study cannabis at UCLA. And we have a lab now at UCLA where we can bring people in. We can administer cannabis in a controlled setting, just like your recording studio. Mm-hmm. And then we can measure scientifically the impact on their body, their brain functioning, how it makes them feel in a scientific way. But in order to do that research, we have to get a lot of clearance through a lot of different, federal and state level agencies. So it takes an extra almost 12 months to get the study going. So a lot of researchers are like, I can't deal with that kind of red tape, and they just decide not to do it. Or I can't deal with that kind of scrutiny. So even like storing the cannabis on campus at UCLA, you got to have you don't have to have armed guards, but you have to have secure systems and a lock, and you have to spend a lot of money to make sure that no one can steal the cannabis, because it's, again, Schedule 1, highly regulated substance. There's been talk in Congress over the last, since Obama was president, about taking cannabis off Schedule 1, which would then open it up so that researchers could do more research, faster research, and not have as many guidelines. But there's still resistance. Now, people have always said to me, where is this resistance coming from? And it comes from, again, in the halls of Washington. There's still enough people in positions of power that don't believe in cannabis as a therapeutic potentially for good. That still view it as marijuana. Yeah. They still view it as a way of, that's the way of Mexicans, or that's the way of communities of color.
Or people just want to get high.
Yeah, that's the way of stoners who are lazy. Quote, very fine people, if you want to say that. But so there's still a lot of stigma and dogma in the halls of Washington. But the tide's changing very quickly. And I think in the next 3 to 5 years, I think we will see Schedule 1 removal of cannabis. And the other thing there about too, if you remove it from Schedule 1, that means pharmaceutical companies, that means cannabis companies can now start their own research projects there as well. so much of research that comes from America, not just from NIH, but from private industry. Think about some of these antibodies and these vaccines that we're currently looking at for COVID. None of those are developed by the federal government. They're all generated by private industry. So the same thing, I think, will hold true for cannabis. When it becomes easier to do research, then you'll see a lot of the private sector doing very important research as well.
This is where I can see where regulation becomes a problem. There's a such thing as too much, because now we have barriers to you all just, going out there, coming up with different ideas, and it sort of stops researchers that would normally want to just dive right into it from this is too much. I can't.
Yeah, exactly.
UCLA is a powerhouse. It is. You have all of the Southern California schools. You have USC, UCLA. You guys have a lot of money. Not every school has the funding that you all do. So this is where regulation is good, but right. I can also see where too much regulation would be a problem.
And I think when people say, well, how come we don't know more? How come we don't know more about how cannabis works or to what it's good for or exact dosages? And I say, because we haven't done the research. We haven't been able to do the research. But the biggest part is we don't have as many researchers, a workforce. Think about a lot of young men and women coming out of PhD school or med schools who want to get into this world. And they're told, oh, you can't do cannabis research because you can't get funding. Or you can't do cannabis research because there are too many hoops. And if they don't have mentors, why would there be another generation behind us to do that? So that's part of the story of having a UCLA cannabis research program, is to attract young, eager researchers from all walks of life: history, politics, science, neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, to be the next generation of researchers. As an example, I've never been, no, I shouldn't rephrase. I've been to a number of scientific conferences on cannabis. I've also been to a number of conferences on cannabis that are trade shows. The difference is night and day. The cannabis professional societies are scientists who use the rigorous scientific methods, who ask tough questions, who are not here to make money from cannabis. That's very different than when you go to a cannabis trade show.
Right.
And they say, hey, here's our vape pen product, 100% pure. You're going to love it. 30% THC with a little bit of CBD kick. And I say, what's this good for? Oh, it's great for sleep. How do you know? Oh, because I tried it myself. Well, is that science? No, that's a sales job. And I think that's where, for people differentiating, how do I really know? That's the hardest thing. So you walk into a dispensary right now and you say, I'm just curious about cannabis. I just want something for anxiety or sleep or my back pain. And you ask the person behind the counter, can I have something for my back pain? And again, you don't ask the bartender, you don't ask the person at the Ralph's or the 7-Eleven, hey, what vodka is good for my sleep? That doesn't happen.
No. Yeah.
But that does happen inside dispensary, recreational dispensaries. Same thing. If you say to a bartender, hey, I want a cannabis that'll give me a 4-hour euphoria followed by a 6-hour reduction in my anxiety. What do you have for me? Oh, I got this product. No, they're just throwing darts at the board. So I keep going back to that because I want people in their mind's eye to think about where we are in 2020 with our knowledge of cannabis, our supposed knowledge of what it's actually in there and we don't really know, and what happens if we start ingesting this product for years. Again, we've only been legalized for 3 years. What happens after 20 years of use? So one of the things I always wonder is we didn't know about the opioid epidemic or crisis when we were in medical school. So I remember going to medical school, and you probably do as well. Pain is the 5th vital sign. Treat pain aggressively, otherwise, blah, blah, blah. No one foresaw any of this. And here we are.
That we will be a part of causing the...
Exactly. We would be the problem. So again, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, are we going to be talking with another follow-up podcast about a cannabis crisis that was created back in the old 2020? I certainly hope not. And that's where I hope discussions like this gets people informed and to speak up and do things right.
What I also worry about is I think things are changing, but I remember... You can go back to when you interviewed for medical school also. Can you imagine if, you're at, because they always ask you about your hobbies. What do you like to do for fun?
Right.
And if you give an answer that says, Oh, well, after work, at the end of the week, it's Friday. I like to go out with friends, happy hour. Yeah, that's what I do on my Fridays, and sometimes I do it on Wednesdays and Mondays, happy hour.
Right.
And happy hour is essentially cheap drinks, cheap food, friends get together and do that. That's not a problem.
Yeah.
But if someone during their medical school interview were to say, hey, on a Friday night, I like to smoke a little bit, read a good book, sit in the tub, and, that's my Friday. I don't have work Saturday or Sunday. That person, I don't think would get into school.
And again, they can't say that now because that's still federally an illegal activity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So if I worked in the Veterans Administration, the hospitals for the VA, they still random urine drug tests their employees and their doctors because it's federally illegal. Mm-hmm. Because technically that's a violation of the drug-free workplace, which is one of the federal government, parts. So but imagine now, just what you just said, now more and more parents and families are like, okay, that's fine. When I grew up, if I said that to my dad and mom, oh, you know what, we're not going to drink tonight, but Johnny's coming over and he's bringing a fresh batch of OG Kush, but we're not going to drive anywhere and he's going to sleep over. Is that okay, Mom? And we want to order some pizzas. Can you imagine the 80s saying that?
Oh, no.
Now
I was only 2 during the 80s,
but in 2020, that conversation is happening tonight.
Yeah,
in some household in Los Angeles. So some people always say to me, "What are the things that you want to make sure people know?" And I always have some take homes I like. No cannabis for anyone under 21. I don't see this as an adolescent product. This is an adult product. Number 2, respect the power of the plant. So we have a plant, again, that has incredible potential, but we're not there yet to determine proper dosage, proper route of administration. How long should you take it? And imagine the way medical cannabis has been built for the last 20 years in California. It's not proper. If I see you as a doctor and I want to see you and you recommend cannabis to me, as it stands right now, I don't go back and see you ever again. That just doesn't make sense. The proper way is I see you and you have education and knowledge about what proper cannabis usage is, what strains used, what dosage, what formulations, what indications. Oh, if you have back pain, you should use a sativa. If you have anxiety, you should use edibles. If you have PTSD, you should use 2 joints of sativa followed by 2 edibles of indica at 4 o'clock. That level of precision is nowhere near. Right. That hasn't been established. So that's number the next point, respect the power of the plant. And the last thing is about addiction. The addiction risk is real. It happens about 9% from the very first time you take cannabis. You have a 9% chance of developing an addiction to cannabis. Now, 9% sounds like, is that a lot or is that a little bit? So the very first time you use cocaine, that number is like 25, 30%. The very first time you use heroin, that number is like 25%. The first time you eat a kale salad, that you develop an addiction to a kale salad, I think it's like less than 0.0000000. Yeah. Less than that. So it's not 0. It's less than these other substances, but it's not insignificant.
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. 9% from the very first time you ingest cannabis. There's about a 9% chance that you could develop a cannabis use disorder. Now, to lower that limit, and the biggest predictors, again, earlier onset, meaning the first time you ever try. So the younger you are that you try, and then the more frequent you use, that also escalates the rate of addiction. So that's why it's so important for us to tell our the young people, if you do use sparingly, or delay the onset from the very first time you actually ingest. So there's a huge difference between someone who starts at 12 years old versus 22. Huge difference between a high school student who uses once a month, who then uses versus who uses 4 times a month. If you're using it more frequently, or you start at a younger age, your risk of developing the addiction actually is way higher than 9%.
I can't tell you how many times I've had that conversation about, yes, it's different from heroin. Yes, it's different from cocaine, but it can still be harmful. It's not benign.
Right.
These are with 15 and 16-year-olds.
Yeah.
that I'm having these conversations with. And then I have to go and try to actually figure out why they're using.
Yeah.
A lot of them aren't using because it's fun.
Right.
They're using it because they have anxiety.
Or they're depressed, or ADD.
I'm like, well, what do you mean you have anxiety? You're 15.
Right.
You're 15.
Yeah.
What else is going on?
Yeah.
Essentially. And you know, those conversations are tough because, again, I'm coming at it from the perspective of, hey, I'm a doctor. And a lot of them already have this idea that I'm already going to tell them no to this, no to that. It's like, listen, man, I've been there. Can you talk a little bit about the effects of cannabis on brain development?
Yeah. I mean, and this is, again, you're a child adolescent psychiatrist. You know this better than I, but
I know a little bit.
Here's the facts that we know now. We know that the earlier you start using, and if you start using regularly, the more likely you will actually create memory and cognitive problems by the time you reach the age of 30. Mm-hmm. So, but if you don't start using cannabis until after 2021, you don't have those cognitive impairments when you reach the age of 30. Mm-hmm. So again, it's a substance that changes the course of brain growth and development. Yeah. Well, what else changes the brain growth and development? Alcohol, tobacco, sugar, video games, probably, Diet Cola. I mean, all caffeine, all that stuff does. So I think that's, and again, the other part that a lot of parents still, it's amazing to me, they don't grasp, is that the cannabis available in 2020 is not the cannabis available in 1990. Again, parents don't, if they're not familiar with that world, they go, oh yeah, it's just weed. You know, when I was in high school, we used a little bit. Those street percentages of THC back in 1990 was about 3 to 6%. Seizures of just cannabis seized by the police. Mm-hmm. Now, cannabis seized by the police, that average median THC content is as high as 30 to 40%.
When the THC is that high, where is this? Is the CBD level different?
Well, there's two things. Well, again, it's potency. So again, it's about potency, meaning what is the potency of THC content inside that cannabis by weight that I'm consuming. Okay. So if it's a flower, or if it's an oil, or if it's some of the harder products are called wax or shatter, or those things. Those are by weight way more potent with THC, so that when you ingest an ounce or half an ounce or whatever, the same by weight, their potencies are way level, so much higher. And that's where the differences happen. Higher potency products that are, again, 70-80% THC are going to have a huge impact on the body, brain, and mind. Again, it's like alcohol, whether you use 40 proof or 80 proof, you're going to have a way different experience based on potency. Crack cocaine is a way potent form of cocaine, which is why it was so much more reinforcing. Mm-hmm. Is higher potency THC products like wax and shatter and dabs, are they more reinforcing? Of course they are. Do people like them? Of course they do. Do some people have more adverse effects? Of course they do. And that's where some folks, unfortunately, get psychotic or confused or have impairments. One of my favorite memes on the internet that's propagated is, you see, number of deaths caused every year by opiates. It'll say 70,000. Mm-hmm. Number of deaths caused every year by tobacco, 500,000. Number of deaths caused every year by cannabis, 0. And then it'll say, any questions?
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And so people get there, yeah. But I say that's incorrect, because the number of overdose deaths from cannabis is 0. People don't die from intoxication and overdose like they would from heroin, but they die while intoxicated. Car accidents, they fall off roofs, they get shot, they have assaults.
Laced with something.
Yeah.
Gets laced off.
And so, and they die. So it's not, that's false. Now, people will then say, oh, but it's nowhere near the 70,000 deaths in America from opioids. Well, that's because we don't have an equivalent cannabis product that is like Oxycontin or fentanyl yet. Now, we do, again, have these 70-80% products, so they're definitely out there. So there's concern about that, again, falsely giving a false sense of security that, again, it's just weed and that it's fine. Again, I think of this as like seatbelts or, food we eat. I mean, there's risk in everything we do. There's risk in video games. There's risk in the internet. There's risk in social media. There's risk in just the air we breathe, particularly here in California. And so when you put it all together, when you start putting cannabis in that same category and say it's just stuff that's available in our world, but let's evaluate how risky this is to you, then suddenly we can get away from this conversation of, oh, it's, you don't get it and, you're old, you don't understand it, to no, this is just what's out there, and let's really understand that risk and evaluate those risks a lot better. I mean, do you talk about seatbelts to your kids? I mean, is that something that comes up much?
Well, the parents tend to. I mean, people just know.
Yeah, because it's ingrained in our society that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I grew up in a world where seatbelts were just starting to get regulated. And I remember as a kid, a lot of pushback by people saying, "You're forcing me to wear seatbelts." Well, that's my God-given right not to. So, and now, fast forward 20 years, it's not even a question. People just do it. I wonder if that's where we're heading with mask wearing. Like,
it's nothing's changed. You think things have changed? People just always want to. That's my right to do.
That's my right to do it. Yeah, it's my right to kill myself if I want. So
yeah, man. I again, this is just what you just said within the past 5 minutes. Again, I want to go back to what was said earlier, folks. You can do whatever you want. It's your life. But I think you and I can both agree on this. If you choose to use cannabis or coke or whatever it is you choose to use, just have all the facts. Have all the information. I will say this, though, for kids, I am a little bit more aggressive with 15, 16-year-olds. I'm a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah.
I mean, because you mentioned the brain development, and I explained this too, teenagers can typically grasp this, right? Everything that we do in the brain, I mean, this is all, it's myelin. That's too scientific of a word for people to understand, but brain development means that there are connections that are being made for proper decisions to be made. Right. In the brain. Right. And when you use cannabis, you're going to slow down those connections, and things aren't connecting like they should, and you're going to make worse decisions.
That's right.
Right? If you slow down the process. Yeah. You only get about 26 years to get a fully formed brain.
That's right.
That's
right.
And cannabis can slow it down. And also when I say slow it down, that means again using it excessively, using it at high potency. Right. And sometimes when you explain that to kids, they get it. They get it more.
I like the house analogy. Like if your brain is a house and you're building a house and you want to build it with the fastest internet speed possible, right? And if you use fiber optic cords and you run it up to the basement, into the bedroom, to everywhere, and that cord is clean and it's tight and everything's good, you're going to get fast connections throughout the house. But if you use cheap material, or you do a shoddy job, or you don't put the proper covering on the cable and it's loose, or you introduce water and water gets into the cable, or termites start chewing away at the cable, and then those connections don't go well. And I think about all those things in life: sleep deprivation, trauma, substances. Those are all things that interfere with that house being built, with those connections and cables being properly laid down. Right. It's an easy analogy. People get that. I like it because people will say, oh my gosh, well, if I screw it up now, is there a way to repair it? Of course. We can bring in a repairman. And while you're young, we can lay down new cable. We can lay down new alternate ways of getting the internet in various parts of your basement. But when you're older, that damage is just bad.
Done. It's there.
Or you go for years of neglect and you don't take care of it early. By the time you then want to look at it, you can't replace it. Right. And I think that's a powerful message. But again, you go back to what is the demand for people? Why do people have such demand for cannabis? And I think that's the other part we're trying to really study and examine, is because it's so, how much of this demand for cannabis is being pushed because of the industry saying this is great and pop culture and people celebrating it, or how much of it is because there's a really interesting product out there. The demand for cell phones and smartphones is huge because these are amazing products that people want. Is that the same thing for cannabis? Is it, an amazing product that more and more people really, really want? So some of the things we're beginning to see is that most of the cannabis purchased in California is by a very small percentage of people, the people who use a lot. How many new introductions to cannabis happen every year because of billboards? We really don't know. So in other words, like, how many people would never have tried cannabis now are trying it because it's readily available?
Well, it's a whole culture.
The whole culture and everything, yeah. And
they have an award show.
Yeah, and the way it's portrayed and the way it's highlighted. CBD, wellness, health, go ahead and try some. Won't hurt you. And again, for the vast majority of people who use cannabis, it probably won't. But for those who do, 9% develop an addiction. Or for those who develop a mental health condition caused by cannabis use.
Well, let's cover that now.
Yeah.
So if the connection between cannabis and psychiatry, patients that we see in our offices, what does cannabis do or not do for those people? We're talking about depression. We're talking about anxiety. What happens when you mix cannabis with somebody that might be, I guess, at risk or
all sorts of things, good, bad, ugly, and everywhere in between.
Okay.
So the way I think of it, if you were a patient, I'd say, here, look, we know that cannabis has the therapeutic potential to treat mental health conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Can it treat depression? Can it treat anxiety? Can it treat PTSD, trauma? Sure, but the science studies right now say that it does not have that ability. On the flip side, we know that, and that's number one. Number two, cannabis, without a doubt, if you have depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, makes those conditions worse. It doesn't make them better. And that's where a lot of patients get hung up. They're like, whoa, what are you talking about? It totally makes it better. I sleep better. Cannabis may make the symptoms of your mental health condition better, insomnia, suicidal thinking, but it doesn't make the full condition better. So in other words, you may temporarily feel a little bit better, but in the long run, you're still going to be suffering problems from the depression and anxiety. And I think that's so important. Number three, surprisingly, people are shocked when they hear this, but cannabis increases the risk of suicidal thinking. Cannabis increases the impulsive behavior of people to go do things like gamble excessively or use more drugs or sleep with other people you shouldn't have, putting yourself in risky positions that then lead to potentially really traumatic situations, assaults, arrests, robbery, burglary, you name it. So the last part, of course, is does cannabis, if you take it, could you then develop, say, a depression or a psychotic illness that you would not have developed at all had you never ingested cannabis? And the story is beginning to show that, yeah, there are some people out there who are biologically vulnerable that once they start using cannabis on a regular basis, again, changes the wiring in the brain to the point that even when they stop using cannabis, what's left is a mood disorder or psychosis, a scar, if you will. And that's really tricky because then it suggests, wait a minute, we better find out who those people are who are at risk so that they don't get exposed to this substance in the future. And I think that's a really, really tricky thing, but it's an important thing that we have to do in our field.
My first patient, without going into too much detail, essentially he smoked for the first time and just completely flipped.
Yeah.
I can't go into too much detail about it, but essentially we had to just tell him, you're allergic to cannabis. Right. It wasn't laced.
Yeah.
It wasn't laced.
It
was just pure cannabis.
Yeah.
And that happens with people. And again, going back to what I initially said when we first started off, just because you've had a good experience with it doesn't mean that other people have. It might be a small percentage of people that end up in our office that have used way too much.
Yeah.
And what I often notice is it kind of starts, like you mentioned, the earlier they start, they start to smoke and they're treating anxiety, they're treating depression, they're having a tough time as a kid. And they just start using more and more. The potency starts.
Tolerance develops. Yeah.
Yeah, you develop a tolerance. Yeah. And then it's every day. It's all day. They're going to work, and then they go to work, and then they end up getting in trouble at work. They come to work smelling like weed, and it's a whole thing.
Yeah. Stalled development. And that's where, again, that's part of that stereotype when people say, well, what does someone with a cannabis addiction look like?
Yeah.
We close our mind's eye. We're still thinking 90s, long hair, grunge, lazy, listening to records in the basement. But that's not what it is. When you look at people who show up to treatment for cannabis addiction, all walks of life, CEOs, doctors, lawyers, old, young, ethnic minorities, white people, you name it. But all the story is the same, that their relationship with cannabis has taken an unhealthy turn. It's caused problems, and they still turn to cannabis thinking cannabis will help their problem, when in fact it just makes it worse.
And you just don't see them like
don't
you do
see it.
opiates and coke.
Right.
You don't see them.
You don't
But
see
they
them because,
exist.
again, you don't see like the cannabis withdrawal. It's there, but it's not nearly as shocking and as intense as opiate withdrawal.
Could you talk about that? The
Yeah,
cannabis
and
withdrawal?
so like there is a cannabis withdrawal where if you're using regularly and then you stop, anywhere between 48 hours to 72 hours later, you can develop withdrawal symptoms, which might be trouble sleeping, nausea, not eating, a little flu-like symptoms. It's vague. It's not, what's happening. It doesn't result in death, but it still doesn't feel good. And it's enough to kind of screw up your day is what we usually say to people. So oftentimes people don't recognize that what they're going through is withdrawal. So they just think, oh, I got a bad batch. Or, you know what, I just need to use more. So they use more and then they feel better. But then just deepens the cycle of the body getting so tolerant that it has to have higher levels of cannabis in order to maintain normal body functions.
I think we somewhat got off track because we were talking about legalization. What are some concrete positives? I don't know if you can go bullet point by bullet point, but what are some concrete positives of legalization?
Well, the number one for me is if we legalize and regulate it properly is to eliminate the unregulated market. And what that means then is that there's a safer product available for people to use. So a product that's not full of pesticides or poisons is exactly what it says on the label. So that's a good thing. Number two, taking away the decriminalization part. I mean, think of how many lives have been ruined, not just impacted, but ruined by being arrested for cannabis through the years. That's a felony. It's a felony on your record if you get arrested for cannabis possession with intent to distribute. We're talking 5-10 years in federal prison. You can't get a job after that. Number three is, again, the tax revenue base. And that's always an important part because if suddenly you have $1 billion industry or whatever, and you're not collecting any taxes that go back to the government to use to make society better, where's that money go? And so oftentimes people wonder, well, where over the last 30 years have cannabis money gone? It's gone to criminal organizations or it's gone to underground cottage industry. So the state never realizes that. The federal government never gets that funds to reinvest into the community to mitigate the harm. So that's number three. Number four, it's just the right thing to do. It's meeting people's demand. The public has spoken, not just in our state, but in many states across, that the public wants cannabis as part of the American lifestyle. So I think we need to respect the will of the people, and that's why it should be there as a legalized service, as a legalized experience. But I think the harder part is figuring out how to do that properly to prevent addiction, to prevent public harm, other sort of negative aspects of making this more legal. Is
there any concern for big corporations? Because once money becomes a part of the equation, Marlboro, I don't know all the cigarette companies, they're going to dive right in.
Well, they already have. And again, that's what's called big weed. So big weed, a lot of cannabis companies are supported by venture capitalist money, Fortune 500 investors, very sophisticated people. It's a whole, again, industry. A few of these conventions I've been to, we're talking 30, 40,000 people. So there's a massive number of investors attached to it. I think, again, that's actually a good thing if it's regulated properly.
If regulated.
Because, again, you think like big tobacco. Now, on the face of value, they have a tremendous negative view of people view big tobacco. But they still employ millions of people in America. There's the economic backbone of many different states. They are tax-based for many states. So there's still a debate about, what does big tobacco really do for Americans? We don't plan to get rid of big tobacco. So the same thing is about as big weed expands, how do we do it properly so that they do it in a way that isn't predatory, that is on the up and up, and it has the best interest in people's lives moving forward. And I think that's challenging because, again, people will look at, if you wanted to work for a cannabis industry, if I came out of college right now and I said to my parents, you know what, I'm going to go work for the cannabis industry, they're still going to be like, oh, really? You're going to do that? Why would you work for those people? Mm-hmm. But these are legitimate, above board, regulated businesses. And I think as we legalize more and more, they'll become more and more. What I'd like to see, again, are those partnerships between cannabis industry, governments, nonprofits, university, and community-based organizations and centers.
So that people that don't have billions of dollars backing them can become entrepreneurs.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Or vice versa. So you don't have these big faceless corporations going into like urban centers or inner cities and
putting liquor stores.
That's right. Exactly. Disproportionately. Yeah. I mean, one of the things about big tobacco, they had all this data and all this been revealed through years about targeting lower socioeconomic parts of the cities, urban cultures, using specific marketing to try and get more business from a vulnerable population. So it's the same thing with cannabis, is that we really shouldn't stand for that. And in fact, that's where, like, if a big cannabis company partnered with an urban community to say, what does your community need? How can we help to make the community better while still selling a product that the community is asking for? And that's a little utopian, I'm sure, but I think that's
a goal.
That's the goal, and that's the start. And I think, again, a lot of people. It's interesting. I work with a lot of college students who want to get into the cannabis business, and we say to them, you should look into that, and you should. And they say, well, I didn't know I could. I said, if it's a legal, above board business that's regulated in the state, of course you can look at that. Now, the irony is that at UCLA, we can't endorse any of that. We can't take any money from cannabis industry because that's a violation of federal law. We can't promote students to go into working for a cannabis industry. But those are things I think we're going to change over time eventually and modernize our thinking.
So right now, you mentioned earlier, this is what the business would be about. Cannabis, THC, CBD, some component of that. If you take out the THC, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a practicing psychiatrist. People have these questions of me all the time. CBD, how beneficial is it really in comparison to just smoking regular cannabis? What are we doing here?
I never even heard about CBD until 3 years ago, and then suddenly I can go down to my local drugstore and there it is on the shelf.
It's everywhere, yeah.
Or I can buy it on Groupon. And again,
it's in lotion. It's in.
it's a $20 billion projected business. Cosmetics, pets. I was in a store the other day. It was CBD infused pillowcases. So again. The concept is amazing. The idea that here is a naturally derived compound that does not alter your senses, that can promote pain relief, reduce inflammation, improve immune defenses, improve sleep, improve just a sense of wellness, and have very little side effects. Sign me up. So you can see the selling point is there. People get confused as to why is it that I can go into a Bed Bath & Beyond and buy CBD infused sheets, but I can't go to a Ralph's and buy any, THC. It goes back to 2018. There was something called the Farm Bill that got passed, which basically the United States said, hey, if you grow and sell hemp, which is a form of a cannabis plant. Okay. And hemp is defined as a cannabis plant that has less than 0.3% THC. So if you grow hemp plant, which is cannabis, you can now sell that and everything inside that plant anywhere in America. Drugstores, 7-Eleven, you name it. So that's why on the shelves, when we see CBD-infused gummies on Groupon, it's a legal seller because they're selling CBD-infused products that were derived from a hemp plant that did not have THC above 0.3%.
Oh, okay.
So it's a very strange world because, again, it's very confusing to the average person. It's confusing to me when I go and say, well, how are they able to sell CBD? That's regulated. That's still technically CBD is still Schedule 1.
CBD is
Schedule 1.
Okay.
In the federal government's eyes. Schedule 1 when it's not derived from a hemp plant. When it comes from any other plant that has, THC above 0.3%, that's Schedule 1.
Okay.
So it's very confusing. So at the end of the day, the story on CBD is that, the science is beginning to show that it definitely helps with pain. It definitely probably helps with inflammation. It does help with sleep and anxiety. But again, what dose? Who knows? How to take it? Gummies, lozenge, puff. Vape pen, who knows? How long before it wears off its wellness? Nobody knows. How many times a day should I take it to maximize it? What time of day should I take it? Nobody knows.
On a population level.
Yeah, on a population, we're nowhere near that. But so a lot of my patients say, hey, doc, what do you think of me trying it? I say, listen, I'm not going to stop you. But I always say the following. If you're going to try it, use it from a regulated dispensary. Keep notes on it very closely. Try and be consistent how you take it. And you tell me what happens. So oftentimes patients will come back and say, yeah, I tried it for 2 weeks at night, every night, same time, and I noticed no difference. Well, then it's not really work. That helps. That's informative. Instead, they say, well, on Monday I took it at 2. I didn't take it again to Friday morning, and then I didn't take it again to Saturday night, and then I mixed it with alcohol. I have no idea whether it's working or not. So that's helpful to have patients inform us how they're using and whether or not that made a difference or not.
That's what the research says.
That's right.
So in terms of the research for cannabis itself, is there any consensus on what cannabis is effective for or positive for?
There is. And so right now, as of 2020, there's a summary book called that's produced by the United States National Academy of Sciences called The Health Effects of Cannabinoids and Cannabis. I think that's the title. And it's a summary of all the scientific work that's been done on cannabis since the last 40, 50 years. They concluded, and this is 2017, so again, 3 years have passed, that cannabis is good for chronic pain. That cannabis is very good for nausea and vomiting caused by chemotherapy that you use for cancer treatments. The cannabis is really good, or is good if you have a nerve condition called multiple sclerosis and have something called muscle spasticity. Your muscles tighten up and contract, and it's very, very painful. And that's it. The rest of it is we're not sure if it works, but there's enough scientific data to say, yeah, it does work for chronic pain. But what kind of pain? There's different kinds of chronic pain, right? There's musculoskeletal pain. There's neuropathic pain. There's emotional pain.
Yeah.
So there's diabetes pain. So as of right now, it just says the condition of chronic whole body pain. Your body just is in pain. So even that's still not precise enough, but it's a starting point. So now, since 2017, there have been other studies that have agreed or disagreed or added to that body of knowledge. But again, as of today, if a patient walks to me into my office and say, what dose should I take for chronic pain? And technically by law, by California law, I can't recommend, or I can't make a prescription. That's number one. I can make a recommendation to use cannabis, but I cannot make a recommendation with specificity. So I can't say again, Thomas, use OG Kush 3 times a week, and on every other night, take down an edible of whatever brand, Kiva brand chocolate, and use 1 vape pen throughout the day. I can't say that right now. That's a prescription. Right. I can make a recommendation that, you know what, based on your condition, I believe cannabis may help your condition. And that's the level of the recommendation that the Medical Board of California is comfortable with us doing.
There are 3 things at this point that I think, because I don't know who's listening to this. It could be a parent. It could be people that already know about cannabis. It could be people angry about to write us on YouTube. I don't know. But let's assume that there are people that don't know anything about, this is their first time listening to a podcast. I think we've laid out what cannabis is. I think CBD and THC, that's been laid out. You mentioned 3 things: edibles, you mentioned wax, and you mentioned dabs. Yeah. What the hell are those?
So these are all different kinds of cannabis and how you can consume it. So
let's start with edibles.
Yeah.
I got three things.
So cannabis products come in a whole host. And if you were walking in a dispensary, that's what's so interesting. So my first, I guess called homework assignment to those who are curious is go into a legal dispensary if you're over 21 and ask questions. Look around. Become familiar with what products are being sold and how they're being sold. As an example, the most classic way of ingesting cannabis, of course, is smoking it. Flower. They call it just smoking flower. You just put it in a bowl or you roll it up in a cigarette and you smoke a joint. That's the classic way of ingesting cannabis. But you also can ingest it orally. You can eat it. And that comes typically in a form of an edible, like a gummy. But you can also drink it, just in a standard tea or just a soda. And that would all be kind of oral ingestions of cannabis. Then you can you can also take what we call a high potency product, like a vape pen, which would be an oil, or dab, wax, or shatter. What these are high potency containing.
Before you even move on to dabs,
Yeah.
Can you lay out what the potential problems are with edibles?
Oh, sure. Okay. So edibles, unlike smoking, you ingest it orally, so it goes into your stomach, and it's going to take a little longer for it to take effect.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens with some people is they take a gummy and they think it's like smoking cannabis. Oh, I should feel something right away, and they don't. So then they end up taking a second gummy, and then a third gummy because it tastes good. And then within the first 15 minutes, they've now taken, instead of say like 2 or 3 milligrams of cannabis or 5, they've now taken 40. And if they're a novice user, as the body level goes up over the next hour and a half, they can then reach a point of intense response. And also because edibles are much slower getting rid out of the body. So let's say you have an intense dosage, it'll still take 8, 10, 12 hours to get rid of. So it's not like alcohol where it metabolizes a little quicker. Metabolism off cannabis sometimes can be slow. So that's why if you're intoxicated and experiencing adverse effects, that could be problematic because you might be stuck in that zone for a while.
The reason why I even thought that would be something very important, I'm okay with cannabis. I really just have this is my own personal issue with
Right.
edibles.
Yeah.
Because the stuff that I've seen with edibles, again, this is us professionally in practice. These are young people, by the way.
Right.
Above the age of 26, do what you want. But young people, I've seen ingest a cookie and do what you just mentioned.
Right.
But even when it's not overeaten,
Right.
they have such a reaction to it. I forgot what the molecule is called when it gets metabolized in the liver.
Right. Yeah,
But
it's a long fancy name. Yeah.
It's a big fancy name, but essentially what you just described was the fact that when you inhale something and you inhale cannabis, it goes directly into the bloodstream.
Goes directly to the bloodstream, to the lungs, to the brain, and then bypasses the liver, and then ultimately, is just excreted out in our urine and our poo. So
there's no conversion.
No.
But when you eat it, it goes from your
stomach to your blood to your liver,
and it's converted to
your
something.
kidneys. It's converted to something else, and that metabolite lingers around a lot longer. And it's just a different way of taking it in. So it all makes sense. Like if you have an asthma and you use an inhaler, you use a puffer and you get an effect immediately because you go from your lungs right to your lungs. But lots of people with asthma, they take pills to kind of open up their lungs, and that just takes a while. So again, route of administration, how you take it in matters because that will change your experience with it. These high potency products, and they have all sorts of fancy names.
Now we're going to dabs, and
So essentially, these are high potency products that look like goo or real waxy substances, like caramel, toffee pudding, beeswax, real hard plastic candies. And the way they're used is that they're usually high, they're fired up. So people light them up, usually with a high flame, like a butane lighter, or they'll melt them on an aluminum foil. And as they melt, the fumes that they give off are then usually inhaled directly into the lungs. So it's essentially taking a high potency product quickly into the lungs. They're not eaten, they're not ingested. But because they have very high levels of THC in them, 60 to 70%, and you're inhaling them, you're getting them into your lungs quickly and rapidly. And same thing, you'll have a very powerful effect right away.
60 to 70%.
Potency, that's right. And so the same thing, though, that's why when it's that potent, you can take the same amount as, say, just a flower, but it's still going to linger around the body a lot longer because it's a much more potent product. It's going to bind to the body's receptors more tightly and it'll last longer. So a single use of a dab or a wax or shatter. And why is it called dab? Well, you're dabbing into your supply. You take a little dab out of this little like waxy substance, and then you dab it on a nail, and you heat up the nail and then the fumes, and then you inhale that. And there's a million YouTube videos on this too.
Yeah.
You can do it off a potato, all sorts of interesting things. But for folks in the audience there, again, they say, well, is that illegal? No. If you're over the age of 21, if you buy high potency products in a dispensary and they tell you how to use it this way, that is not illegal. it feels illegal, right? But using all these various
feels
products.
dangerous, Yeah.
Yeah, and again, that's part of your education campaign. That's part of the question is that should high potency products be illegal? Should there be an upper limit to what a person can buy in a regulated dispensary of THC? And to that answer, we don't have an answer. We don't. Again, like take cigarettes. Cigarettes. An average cigarette has like 3 milligrams of nicotine. Well, you can make nicotine products that are way more potent in the cigarette, but they don't because they're bounded by law not to. So and that's part of the ultimate question is again, what is the ideal THC potency that's enough to give people a good recreational experience, but minimize public health harmful impacts? And to that question, I have no idea.
It's tough. Tough,
very tough. Yeah.
So we're getting towards the end. My final question for you. Well, it might be a series of questions, but where is the direction of research headed?
Wherever we can get money
multiple
for,
directions.
wherever we get money for. I mean, I can tell you, here are the essential questions we have. We want to know, at least at UCLA, what we're looking at is, number one, how do we use cannabis to alleviate pain, to treat pain better? And we're talking physical and emotional pain. So I foresee us going down the route of trying to understand clinical trials. So we can say this version of cannabis works really well for pain or for sleep or for anxiety. That's what we'd love to do. Number two, I want to look at, again, how do we stop people from developing cannabis addiction? Cannabis addiction is terrible. It ruins lives. People suffer. We don't want any of that. We want to keep all of this in the lane of people being able to enjoy cannabis recreationally in an adult fashion without harmful effects. So a lot of our research questions are going to be, what's the best way to treat cannabis addiction? Medication, psychotherapy. What's the best way of getting people to identify with cannabis addiction early on to then go in and get treatment before it's too late? There's a huge difference between coming into treatment today versus going into treatment 3 years from now. So lots of various things like that. For me, again, if just involved with the sports psychiatry world, I'm fascinated to know, how does cannabis impact athletic performance? Does it make you a better fighter? Does it make you a better basketball player, or does it hurt? We've had some professional athletes say, without cannabis, my career would have been over years ago. I've had other athletes whose careers never got started because of cannabis. So really interesting thing. And along the way, we're going to find out public health questions that we never even dreamed of that are going to come up. So as an example, before the pandemic hit, there was a series in 2019 of men and women who young healthy people who started developing these serious lung injuries from vaping. And they ended up hospitalized in the ICU, and some of them died.
I think this was in the news.
Big time in the news, 2019, before the pandemic. There was about almost 60 deaths in America from vaping-associated lung illnesses. Young people that should not be dead, that were dead. The vast majority of those young people were vaping cannabis-related products. So it turns out that we think that why their lungs were subjected to such intense damage is that they were vaping unregulated cannabis products that had this chemical called vitamin E acetate in there that was really bad for the lungs. That would never, ever be in a regulated product. It was an unregulated product. It's cheap. It's easy. It's like, grade D meat. And customers had none the wiser. And when we started to look at that issue, when we asked some of these people, well, where did you get the cannabis? Oh, I got it in the dispensary. But the dispensary they bought it from was an unregulated dispensary. So they had no idea that what they were buying was not a tested product. So those are some of the issues that I never even dreamed of. And when we were starting to learn about that, we said, we better get in front of this to understand what's in this cannabis product that's killing people off. Why is it that dispensaries are allowed to still sell this without being regulated? And again, should we even allow high potency products like this to be on the market? We don't allow, again, certain pain meds to ever be on the market, even with prescription, because of their potency. They're just not allowed. So at what point should we allow recreationally what is that ceiling? What percentage of THC should we allow? Again, we don't know. And
right. It's tough. It's
very
tough
tough
questions. You know, but I think one of the reasons why you're here is because I think you are able to look at this from an unbiased, objective perspective, which I think is very important. We don't have the answers to these questions, but we're willing to look at the evidence and try to figure it out. Yeah. That's important.
Absolutely. And on our website, I'll put a quick shout out for that. It's cannabis.semel.ucla.edu.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you.
Cannabis.semel, semel.ucla.edu. We also have a Twitter handle at UCLA Cannabis. And right now, during the pandemic, we've started to do monthly conversations about cannabis, where we do just what you're doing here. We bring in a cannabis expert and we go into a deep dive on various topics. We've had one on cannabis and lung injury. We've had one on cannabis and CBD, and we're doing one tomorrow actually on just what it's like to be a cannabis researcher and all the barriers that we face. So this is by putting out what we think to be our good academic products will hopefully stimulate a whole new generation of researchers to get involved and start spitting out research that makes a difference.
Is there any other way that people can support UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative or some other place in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. They can go to our website. They can sign up. They can join our mailing list. They can donate if they want to donate. Tax-free, tax benefits. We can do that. Or if you're a student in the Los Angeles area, college, medical student, or research, give us a call. We're always looking to do collaborations. And if you're a community-based organization and you have stories and ideas, we're open to collaborations. We can do education, we can do trainings, and we just want to learn more. We're just hungry for talking about cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say this enough. I think the whole point of this discussion was not to go for, not to go against, but to just lay out what we know.
There you go.
That's it.
There you go.
That's it. So again, cannabis enthusiasts, anti-cannabis people who don't care, relax.
That's super good.
All right. Anything else you want to bring up?
No, this is great. Again, cannabis.semel.ucla.edu. Take a look at that. And thanks so much for having me on the show.
All right. Fantastic. We're all finished. Thank you so much.